I come from a little Eastern European country called Belarus, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. Naturally, I've always been curious about what life was like back then, and I love hearing about it from my parents and grandparents. From what they told me, I'm starting to suspect that the Soviet Union wasn't very open to the outside world, especially towards countries that didn't share its ideology. But a limited number of foreign movies made it through the strict censors in Moscow over the years, and some of those that my old relatives loved the most came from Bollywood. During Stalin's rule, domestic cinema was at its worst, and the average Soviet citizen rarely had access to foreign films. After World War II, a few films like Tarzan or Stagecoach were recovered as spoils of war and briefly circulated in Soviet cinemas, but that was it. The country's censorship only started to loosen up a little after Stalin died, and reforms were introduced in a process called de-Stalinization. This occurred quite soon after India gained its independence and was trying to strengthen its position on the international stage. Even if it was a capitalist country, India took a neutral political stance during the Cold War. But the relationship that was established between the USSR and India became quite close over the years, which was reflected in their diplomatic solidarity and prolific mutual trade of goods, including the exchange of art and especially movies. A few Indian films were imported into the Soviet Union in the early 50s, but in 1954 the one that truly caught everyone's attention was Awara. Believe it or not, it was the third highest grossing movie ever in the entire country, even beating the Soviet ones except for The Red Snowball Tree. The movie that got second place was also from Bollywood, but we'll get to it later. Despite disagreements in the government between officials who were more interested in profits and those more concerned with ideology, Bollywood films always got an easy pass compared to those from other countries. Because you see, no matter how communist these bureaucrats were, the smell of money was always stronger than their ideals. If any of these movies was planned for a wide release across the country, they would get dubbed in Russian. Often they would be edited down or separated into two parts, because the average Bollywood movie is at least 3 hours long. Bollywood, or Hindi cinema, is only one of many film industries in India, but movies from other regions in the country and art house films like the ones from Satyajit Ray hardly ever got selected for release, usually being limited to Soviet film festivals at most. These low-budget movies portrayed harsh realities in Indian society, but that's not what the average Soviet moviegoer was interested in. Movie theaters would put a lot more effort into advertising Bollywood movies even compared to domestic ones, because it always ensured packed theaters. In order to appease the government, many venues would swap records, taking the revenue for an Indian film and attribute those results to a Soviet one. But that's not all. There were even Indian-themed film festivals all over the country in several Soviet republics over the years. The first one starting in 1954 when Awara came out. So why were Soviet people so obsessed with Bollywood? Simply put, imagine that for more than 20 years you have nothing but pure propaganda as your main source of entertainment. Suddenly, you can watch movies that have an excitement to them that you've never seen before. Movies with memorable songs, elaborately choreographed dances, melodrama, and an exotic culture that you couldn't even dream of experiencing in real life. People just needed escapism, and Bollywood was one of the only options for them to get it. Even when the Soviet film industry started making more films for the masses like Ivan Vasilievich Changes His Profession or The Diamond Arm, Indian films were still at the top of the charts. Bollywood put up a show like no Soviet movie ever could. They also had an instantly recognizable moral system that made them very accessible. There's good and there's evil, and the good always wins. The romance in these films was always very innocent. You don't even see as much as a peck on the cheek from anyone. But most importantly, these movies were apolitical, and they didn't go against Soviet ideology. It was the best alternative to American entertainment that the Soviet government could provide for its people. But you can't talk about Bollywood in the USSR without mentioning Disco Dancer. Remember when I told you that Awara was the third highest grossing movie ever in the Soviet Union? Well, Disco Dancer was the only Bollywood movie that beat it. To be honest, even after watching it, I'm still not sure why it was so popular compared to other Indian movies. When I asked my parents, they also didn't know, but they were just as captivated by Disco Dancer as anyone else their age in the 80s. Their whole town was crazy about it, the youth going back to the cinema multiple times to rewatch it and endlessly listening to its memorable songs when they came out on cassette. So far, I've mostly been talking about Bollywood's effect on people on the European side of the USSR. They were drawn to these films because of how different they felt from their reality. But for people in the Central Asian Soviet republics, it was actually the closeness of Indian culture to their own that drove them to theaters. Of course, it was also about escapism, but seeing familiar aspects of their culture in these films was something that they didn't get to experience with those made in Moscow. This love affair between the Soviet people and Bollywood was strong and lasting, but it collapsed along with the country in the early 90s. When the USSR opened up, Indian films weren't the only form of foreign entertainment anymore, and people were free to travel, even if most couldn't afford it. Nowadays, these films still thrive among the older generations who grew up with them, mainly because of their nostalgic quality. But for a significant amount of time, Indian films almost single-handedly kept the whole Soviet audience entertained and added a bit of happiness in many difficult lives.